Yeah, it's funny. That's always the hardest question somehow. Um, so, I mean, the Topeka School follows Adam Gordon, who's a graduating senior in the class of 1997 in Topeka, Kansas. And Adam's parents are both psychologists who work at a place called the Foundation, which is this prestigious international psychiatric clinic. His mom is a well known feminist author. His dad is this expert at getting lost white boys to open up in therapy. And on the one hand, Adam is very much his parents' son, like he's a championship debater, he's an aspiring poet. And on the other hand, he's like desperate to pass as a tough kid or a real man in the very like red state surround of the culture outside of the household. So the book is kind of about many things that focus on Adam being torn between these two worlds. It's about the challenge of raising a good son in a culture of toxic masculinity. It's about one family's kind of intergenerational traumas and strengths. And it also wants to be a kind of one window onto the rise of the trolls and tyrants of the new right. And one other thing I should say about it is that Adam is one of the seniors in the class of 1997 who brings this loner named Darren Eberhardt, who, unbeknownst to Adam, is his father's patient at the foundation, into the kind of like social scene of the cool kids. And this has disastrous effects. So that's something like an elevator pitch. I don't know how coherent it was, but that's the kind of if you look at clips on YouTube, right? Like it's ostensibly about debate and the debating of ideas, but it's been transformed into this bizarre glossolalic ritual where people speak at unintelligible speeds because they're all trying to make more arguments than their opponents can respond to in the allotted time. So it actually becomes this weird, almost physical activity where these kids are like spits flying and they're gasping for breath and they're almost passing out. And Adam is both kind of like horrified and interested in this speed debate. I mean, on the one hand, he's interested because he's win and it's going to help him get into college. And on the other hand, even though he's like kind of disgusted by it, sometimes when he participates in it, he feels this kind of moment of poetic transport where like language is totally moving through him in this transpersonal and inspiring and poetic way. And a similar thing happens to him with freestyling, which is also kind of embarrassing. It's another instance of like white appropriation of this spectacularized African American form. But even though it's kind of like busted and silly when he's doing it, he sometimes has these experiences of transport. So like one thing I wanted to do in the novel was to think about these theaters of extreme speech and both like make ruthless fun of them and kind of expose their vacuity, but also to take seriously the idea that there's this moment of real poetic possibility, even in this corrupt form, where like Adam is in contact with the possibilities of language. So in a roundabout way, I think for me, literature's relation to that is that I like to write novels that are in part really interested in the most like shameful aspects of my experience, right? Like anxiety, fraudulence, having been a white kid in the 90s who was freestyling or a kind of right. But it's like I want to go at those elements that are kind of like shameful and complicated politically, but I don't just want to ironize them or make fun of them. I want to use literature to seek out like the kernel of social potential that's in those busted forms, if that makes sense. I literature is a way of kind of um, simultaneously, yeah, simultaneously kind of like exposing what can be shameful or corrupting or hilarious about a linguistic practice, but also to try to like seize the moment of social potential that lurks inside it. Totally. And I wanted to think, I mean, this book is like it's set largely in the 90s and even before, but I mean, Adam is graduating in the late 90s, but I wanted to kind of remember the 90s from the perspective of the Trump era, and to kind of be looking for ways in which the bankruptcy of what passes for public speech now could already be seen, right, in this moment where at least the pundit class was proclaiming the triumph of America. There were all these end of history narratives, right, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the election of Bill Clinton, who was like the cool baby boomer we were supposed to be. It was already this talk about like this post-racial, post-ideological, post-everything moment, right? But of course, it was also right on the cusp of Columbine and these kind of crimes of white nihilism. Yeah, I mean, I think like, I mean, white, like it's really interested in the language of a kind of fragile white masculinity, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to, I mean, of course, like phrases like white fragility or toxic masculinity that are circulating in culture can be, they can be reduced to cliches, but I was very interested in the way that this kind of like terror about being a real man or whatever, or this kind of terror about a kind of identity vacuum that lurks in the heart of the most privileged subject, which is the kind of white male. The way the way that surfaces and gets transferred across generations. And I certainly, in part, the book is a genealogy of a version of my own voice, right? Like where is that anxiety that often leads to like violence, like where is it located in me? And so part of the book, right, like in like that opening scene, which is very much in Adam's adolescence, right? Like when you're an adolescent, you're not just like coming into a new body, you're also kind of testing out different voices. And there are a lot of scenes like that where kind of white men are using language to obfuscate more than they're using it to communicate. And at the end of the book, with the scene on, like where so like the audience doesn't even matter. Like it's a performance, of masculine power where the audience has gone home or whatever. But in the end of the book, it's not just the other father in the playground scene who's failing to manage his son. It's also that Adam, like, the Adam who's moved beyond, who's now a father himself, is still, you see in that scene all these different discourses coursing through him. Like his own father's very gentle way of diffusing tension, but his own kind of reassertion of a masculine violence, right? So the book is an attempt to kind of make visible intergenerational patterning in a way that could help you break it. And the form of the book, like its interest in like Jane's ability to listen as a therapist, wants to say that a kind of like literature might model a kind of listening that's not just a weaponized performance of eloquence. But I want to emphasize that it's not like the young Adam is fucked up and then the older Adam is like in the clear, right? It's very much about the persistence, like that every time you open your mouth, all these different kinds of masculine talk are coursing through you, and like what would be modes of listening, or counter narratives or different ways of talking, that might interrupt that pattern, as you say. So that is the concern of the book. I just want to emphasize that the book doesn't describe Adam as triumphing, over that. It's more that, and that we see in the present with kind of Trumpism, et cetera. Like we see in the present how, on the one hand, the book is a very personal, familial genealogy of the voice, but we also need a kind of national reckoning, right, with rhetorical tendencies. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think you're talking about something really important, right? Which is that there's like a certain kind of autobiographical fiction or autobiographical writing that at least claims that it's going to get rid of artifice, right? Like I'm I'm getting rid of literariness, and I'm just like writing the truth, and I'm writing it all down or whatever. Exactly. And that doesn't interest me, right? Like to me, it is the kind of patterning of aesthetic form and the possibility of the life of the language itself that have their own truth and force. So I mean, I am I I am really interested in, the way that not just like the thought a sentence communicates, but how the actual action and prosody of the syntax becomes like gives you a sense of the actual process of the character's thinking or whatever, right? And this is by no means like this is not like an original idea. This is like the idea of literary art. But I think there is right now a lot of writing that wants to claim, and this has its own history, to break with artifice. And for me, I want to think about how literary patterning and kind of producing constellations and the energy that's contained in the language itself can reveal something that can't be reduced to, the story that's being told. I mean, I also think that we, you know, the the kind of part of the stuff I was interested in examining, like in the first novel, the kind of question about aesthetic authenticity versus fraudulence, or in my second novel, thinking about the way kind of the stories we tell and the fictions we make have real effects, right? And then this novel, trying to think about the kind of way that the voice is an intergenerational technology, right? That it's always a composite of all these voices that have come before us. That for me, those novels were most writable when I made them to a certain degree an interrogation of aspects of my own experience, like the themes, like that. It was like thematic, right? It wasn't that I thought my life was so interesting. It was more that the things I wanted to explore, I had this kind of material at hand. But it's always fictionalized for the sake of literary form and patterning. Like I never like put something in a novel because it's true, unless I think it can participate in a larger truth produced by aesthetic form, if that makes sense. I mean, in my particular instance, I mean, I'm very close with my parents and my mom, who's also a writer, and this book was just really written in conversation with her, you know? So there was, I'm not a, I mean, I sometimes admire and sometimes are really put off by writers who are willing to produce a lot of pain to get a story told that they need to get told. I, I can respect that, and a lot of thorny ethical issues arise. But the kind of boring answer in this case is it was just really written in conversation with my parents. The funny thing where, like, so I have a brother who I'm also quite close to who's not in the book, and he's not in the book. Adam Gordon is an only child in the novel, and he's not in the book for a couple of reasons. One is I don't think my brother would have wanted. I know my brother wouldn't want me to produce this kind of complicated fictional account of him, but also because I actually thought it was in the way of what I wanted to explore. That every scene would end up being about brothers as opposed to about the relationships that I wanted to emphasize. But the book is dedicated to my brother. So there's a way in which it says at the outset, kind of structurally, this is a fictionalized version of a family thinking through things like we've discussed, and I'm kind of sending it to you. And for me, that gesture was a way of saying the book is both deeply involved with lived experience and also not to be confused with the merely real. But for me, in terms of particularly representing a version of my mom talking about a version of her father, about my grandfather, that was really kind of collaboratively written. I don't mean collaboratively written in the sense that I took every, like that if my mom had a stylistic edit, I necessarily accepted it, but collaboratively written in which there was a lot of conversation around it and how she felt about it. And the the book is in many ways really an homage to the parents, even though it also shows them as naive about certain things or having their own problems. It's also kind of an homage to them. And the other thing, which I think is really important, is that there's a way in which you're totally right, that it's about Adam. Like there are these sections written from the perspective of the parents, but it's a little bit more specific than that. I mean, the book kind of dramatizes the way in which it's the older Adam trying to imagine the perspective of his parents, right? They're kind of tears in the voice, or things that the parents would never say or would never know, or anachronisms. Like they're always, past, the parents are always talking about this painting at the Met, but as the book notes, that painting it wasn't at the Met during the time. So I think another thing that's both aesthetic and ethical and kind of an interesting challenge is figuring out how you mark the fictiveness within the work, like how you say this isn't pretending to be to have a monopoly on the real. This is a fictional account, and the drama of the book, the emotional drama of the book, is not that like the mother's voice is perfect. It's that there is this effort on behalf of the older Adam to imagine his childhood from his parents' perspective. So there's a kind of ventriloquism, like that, like the complexities that you're describing are kind of built into the book, as opposed to it being like, here is the truth, here is the mother speaking, here is the father speaking. But yeah, I mean, it's a whole complicated like territory, and I think it's kind of it's very hard to kind of generalize about. I mean, I really admire a lot of the Knausgaard of my struggle, and I also am horrified by by some of that, and it took a lot of courage, and it caused a lot of pain for certain people involved. And I think this book is kind of a different thing, but that's always an interesting kind of question. I mean, Topeka is a big and various place, and it's kind of impossible to talk about, without kind of being reductive. But I think there's no question that, in my lifetime, like when I lived in Topeka, that there was like the rise of the mega church, and I mean, there were always guns in Kansas, but the ever increasing, you know, arms camp that America is, of semi-automatic weapons, and a kind of and a yeah, and I mean, like, and the rights. So let me actually say, start it over and put it this way. Like, one of the things the book wants to think about, again, that 90s fantasy that like liberal elites had, which was like Bob Dole was the old Kansan war hero who got trounced by Clinton, right? This is happening. And the idea was that with Clinton, like there was like all the old hatreds and all the old rivalries and all the old idealizations of like the soldier or a certain kind of masculinity were like giving way to this era of post-ideological technocrats. That was like the liberal Clinton fantasy. But what was really happening, of course, was the seeds of an increasing polarization and weaponization of certain cultural issues. Obviously, a profound racism that never went away and has only grown and grown. I mean, it's the whole history of the country. So there's a way in which the Topeka School does depict the kind of red state of Topeka. But really, one of the things it's most critical about is the liberal fantasy that with the Clinton era, all of this had somehow magically been overcome. Right. So, there's one way to read the book, which is to just say like, oh, this isn't really about Kansas. This is, because this is this elite foundation clique or whatever. And that's kind of true. Like it's more in a sense about a middle class white liberal fantasy losing contact with a political reality than it is just about like, you know, right wingers in Kansas or whatever, right? I think what was happening in the 90s was there was this huge circulation of an elite fantasy that the culture wars were over. And in fact, and in fact, they were deepening and they were hugely exacerbated by neoliberalism, right, which kept allowing the right to basically dump, like there was no real left vocabulary of class that could counter right wing populism that was based upon hatred, right? And so, I mean, obviously this is overstated and there's all kinds of nuance, but one of the things that the book wants to think about is how this can be thought about in relation to Topeka because of this really interesting tension that you're describing between like the culture of the foundation. There's a lot of like, you know, baby boomer leftist Jews who believed that there was a new kind of talk that could diffuse all of these historical problems. And and then the kind of what was beyond the foundation culture, and Adam is kind of torn between them. And the young Adam thinks he kind of has accepted the I don't know if it's optimism, but like the kind of liberal triumphant narrative himself. So he has this right wing debate coach, right, who is teaching him all these tactics of weaponized eloquence, and he thinks the debate coach is kind of like a loser who's like clinging to these old right wing ways, when in fact the debate coach has on a lot of ways history on his side, right? Because he's go on to be the architect of the most right wing government Kansas has ever seen. So a lot of so I guess the book is about to a certain degree how the culture wars are coming or already present, but a lot of it is about a kind of liberal myopia that thought of itself as triumphing over these historical struggles in a way that actually allowed them to fester. But you know, it's hard when you talk about a novel like this because the novel is not a work of total explanatory theory or whatever. Like the novel is very much like involved with one family and its configuration, but it does want to say that some of those dynamics and some of Adam's challenges do bear on these larger questions of cultural division and polarization, and the historical American rhythm of the mobilization of white masculine terror and terrorism, which has come home to roost in Trump, and now we have this election. I mean, thank God Biden won, right? But it was an election between two different fantasies of white nostalgia, right? Like Biden's restoration of this earlier neoliberal moment, which was the conditions in part that produced Trump, versus Trump's idealized racist fantasy of some American past.